Thank you, everybody, for coming to the show. Big happy day. James Snapp is back out of the hospital, retired, fully recovered from his stroke. Thank the Lord.
Well, getting there. My left arm still feels not 100%, but we're getting there.
You look good, bro. You're looking good. You're sounding good. It's awesome. I'm glad. I'm so happy, man. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, Mr. Snapp. And I guess we'll just let it start. Chelsea, start dropping them bombs.
Okay, so do you have like a whole timeline of like, do you know like most gospels that have been written about Christianity? Do you like have a timeline of like the first one that we got, then the second one? I'd like to know.
She's basically asking about manuscript evidence and how far back this goes and how we verify it and all this, I think.
Yes.
Yes. Generally, it's thought that Mark would be the first gospel that was in distribution among the early Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And with Luke, there's quite a bit of swing. But basically, looking into the book of Acts kind of ends without a whole lot of resolution regarding the fate of Paul. And people tend to think that part of the reason for that is that Luke is still waiting to see how it turns out. Well, Luke was killed during the time of Nero, probably around the year 67. So I don't think Acts can be much earlier. It can be much plausibly thought to be later than the year 67. Probably, I think, though, that Luke and Paul arrived in Rome around the year 62.
Okay.
So sometime in the early 60s, that's where I would put the date for.
What gospel do you say was the earliest? Do you think James is the earliest?
I think Mark was the first one. When Peter, in the book of Acts, it says Peter went to another place, and what the place says is never really pointed out in the book of Acts.
Can you explain to Chelsea a bit about how the actual Bible book was formed? Like, and like the mark would be like you're giving it a date of about 60 AD, right?
In the mid
40. I thought it was 40.
So, well, 40 would be amazing. That would be written within like 7 years of after Christ died or something.
Yeah, so, 40 is a bit early.
But still, there's nothing in antiquity that even compares to how early we have stuff for Jesus, right, James? Like,
okay, so Christ died. Was it 33 AD?
That's what they say, around 33 AD.
Yeah.
Okay, and then
around the year 33.
Then we got Mark. So, how do we verify that this was written by Mark?
This is where you have to go. This is where you're going to have to go into the manuscript, how the manuscripts were made and how the Bible was formed, I think.
Well, generally, Mark himself is not so much the source for the Gospel of Mark. Okay. But Mark is considered to be the record of the Gospel of Peter. Not the Gospel of Peter known in apocryphal writings, but it's thought to be the recollections of St. Peter as written down and organized by St. Mark. In Mark, you have very little. You have some, but it's not certainly the main aspect of the book. But you see the events that are there when Peter or somebody that Peter knows is on the scene. Now, that's not entirely the case, but that's usually the case. That's why, for instance, in Mark, you don't have anything about Jesus' birth. You don't have anything about Jesus' upbringing. Things start moving when Peter is on the scene or somebody that Peter knows is on the scene.
So, like, how did the Bible come together? Like, where were all these manuscripts found? Like, they're made in papyrus. Like, can you explain a little bit about the way the Bible was originally put together for her?
Yes. The 27 books of the New Testament, and there's a different story for each one. But basically, in the case of Mark, you have Peter working in Rome and beginning to build up the church there. Then Paul enters the scene in the mid-60s, and he is also there for a little while. But then they're both killed during the time of Nero, and the tradition is that St. Peter requested when he was martyred, because when martyrdom happened, the Romans generally gave the Christians 3 chances to recant, and if the Christian was determined, then they'd get 3 strikes and you're out.
So they gave him 3 chances to say that it was all BS, this religion, pretty much.
Yeah, and so, but after that 3 times, you were condemned to die. And in the case of Paul was a Roman citizen, and so the Romans, they didn't treat their citizens the same way they would treat others, and so Paul was beheaded. And there's a tradition, and of course it's not written in stone or anything. It's not particularly early, but the tradition says that it was at a place called the 3 Fountains, and you can go there to this day and walk around in Rome and see the spot. And probably the tour guide will tell you that that's called the 3 Fountains because a fountain sprang up at every spot where Paul's head bounced. Well, that's the story, but I wouldn't put a lot of weight on that. But as far as Peter dying in Rome, that's generally nobody would say that he was not in Rome when he died. There's no other rival stories to say, no, Peter died over here or Peter died over there. But Peter left behind the record of his recollections of Jesus that he gave to Mark. And that's where we get the Gospel of Mark.
Okay, so it's actually from Peter. Given to Mark.
Well, most of it. Mark contributed some of the organization of material. And there were some parts of it, not big parts, but some parts that weren't from just when Peter was there.
James, can I just thank you again for coming on? I almost feel bad. Like, I hope you're up to this. Like, I know you recovered from a stroke, and I can hear you're kind of with your words. You know what I mean? Like, this is you're cool to do this.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, bro. Thank you, like, so much. Like, I can tell that it's you're kind of trying to process things a little. You sound a little different than before, so you know what I mean. I can tell that you had a stroke. And
a little bit more.
I don't want to push you too hard.
I should go more slowly.
Yeah, I don't want to push. I just don't want to push you too hard. I don't know if that's bad or good for stroke victims to try and make you start thinking of all this stuff.
No,
I don't know. Okay.
Hakuna Matata.
Okay, so like these, like how many different manuscript fragments, like that's what we're trying to ask. Like, how did the history of this Bible get compiled? Like papyrus manuscripts, 50,000, 60,000. Like, where did the majority of the manuscripts come from? Where the Bible was actually written from? Like,
well, before that, I'd like to answer the question about where were the authors.
Okay,
and for the Gospel of Mark, we generally get a picture from the time when Peter is getting on in years, and people are getting to ask, do we have his account in definitive form that we can share with others if we were to leave Rome, or if Peter were to leave Rome? And that's where Mark begins.
I see. Right now, you're talking like way before any of these manuscripts even existed.
Yeah.
Okay. This is cool.
The question is being raised: can we get these accounts in definitive form written down, so somebody else can't come and say, this is what Peter really said? So Mark makes his account, and there in Rome, it's published as the Gospel of Mark, but it's known to be based very heavily upon the recollections of Peter. So you see who is being healed. It's Peter's mother-in-law, and who is the first one to confess Christ? It's Peter. So these are not necessarily unprocessed accounts, but definitely very close to St. Peter, an eyewitness.
Everybody in the chat, listen to this guy too. He's like borderline genius. Like, he knows like what he's saying. Like, if really, guys, I want you to please pay attention to James Snapp. Like, he's very knowledgeable in this field. I thank him for coming and sharing his time.
You're welcome. So that's Mark.
Okay.
Then we have the Gospel of Matthew. Now, Matthew's story doesn't involve Rome at all. He gets a hold of the Gospel of Mark or something very close to the Gospel of Mark.
Mm-hmm.
If Mark is collecting Peter's sayings over time, then it could be that in around the early 60s, Mark might have a small collection of Peter's writings, and toward the later 60s, or mid 60s, 65, 66, he might have a much larger collection of Peter's sayings. But from definitely what's called a earmark, or just called a marking core, that's how Matthew overlaps a lot of what Mark says.
Okay.
Probably 90% of the gospel of what's in the Gospel of Mark is retold in different words, usually in a little bit shorter. But Mark includes a lot of the same things.
So is
Luke also,
the Gospel of Matthew? They basically read Mark and just rephrased it. Is what you're
well,
saying?
it's a little more complex than that. With
Okay.
Matthew's using a source very much like Mark, but he's
Mm-hmm.
also using another source, a source which Luke also used. Excuse me a second. If you compare Matthew and Luke and put them together side by side, there are some parts of them that don't resemble Mark, but they do resemble each other. So that implies that besides Mark, there was another source that both Matthew and Luke had access to, and that could reflect an early apostolic tradition which they both accessed. Matthew himself being an apostle, but once the apostles had a source document, they wouldn't necessarily veer from that too much.
Okay. What is this source document? Is this the stuff that Peter
Um,
wrote?
this is what scholars talk about when they refer to Q. Q stands for Quelle in
Mhm.
German, or its source. Um, Q means whatever it is that Matthew and Luke are both using.
Okay.
Now, I could veer aside from the term Q because a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, they have this Q document," and yet it's never been found. It's only been reconstructed. But
Okay.
I would simply refer to it as the apostolic tradition that Luke and Matthew both knew. And because Luke and Matthew and Mark resemble each other so much in terms of what they say and about how long it lasted and other various details, those three gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels. The
Mm-hmm.
gospels that see the same things more or less from the same angle.
Okay.
And then
Interesting.
John later on, he's probably writing around the year 90. So he's pretty
90.
old. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
90.
John and Matthew, I would put right at the year 69. And probably when Matthew is writing, he's in Antioch, which is north of Jerusalem, north of the Holy Land. And Matthew is writing while Israel's going through a terrible internal conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Israel's basically declared war against the Romans, and the Romans have declared war against the Jews, and things are coming to a head, but it's not quite over yet. So
Okay.
Matthew is concerned for his own people, but he also wants to preserve the traditions in hand about Jesus.
Uh-huh.
By the time John writes, he's so old that people are starting to wonder if he's ever going to die. But
Mm-hmm.
and he's writing probably not around Jerusalem or Antioch, but in the city of Ephesus, which is, well, it's way over toward the eastern side of Turkey. It wasn't Turkey back then, but it's called Turkey now. it was Asia Minor back then, a Roman province. But as John writes, he's writing as like, if you could picture a person, I think one way to picture it is, and this is not original to me, but one way to think about it is like, think of a person who's known the stars as dots, and but then he realized or was taught, no, these aren't just dots, these are stars, these are distant systems in their own right, and it takes on an added significance. So John's looking back at the life of Jesus and sees it and says, what we thought was this was really much more significant. And so John emphasizes the significance of what Jesus was doing. He's not just telling the story on a purely these are the facts, but he wants to give an interpretation and understanding of what the significance of those facts are.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
And so John's the more
John's goes
spiritual
a little,
gospel.
yeah. It goes in like a little deeper into us.
Yeah. One way to picture it is in the very, very ancient times, like 2nd century, each gospel was associated with a certain one of the 4 living creatures around God's throne. And this association was made far and wide in the early church. Even if you have an older copy of the King James Bible, sometimes you'll find on the frontispiece the pictures of these 4 icons. Matthew is represented by the angel or the man, and Mark is represented by the lion, and Luke is represented by the ox. But John gets the eagle, the one that flies overhead and looks down on events from a distance, but also zooms in to see the details in their spiritual understanding. So that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
I feel so bad because every time James comes on, the chat just starts talking about stuff. But it's like, yeah. Sorry, this is for Chelsea mainly anyway, so I'll let you guys just talk.
Okay, so then what came after John's book?
Well, John was in the 90s, but so Paul is way before John, or at least the Gospel of John.
Okay, and then Paul's writings. Did they start at where did they start? Corinthians?
Well, actually, Thessalonians would be the first letters that Paul writes. When we see them in the Bible, what you see is not Paul's letters in their chronological order, usually.
Okay.
They're more in the order of length.
Mm-hmm.
It goes from Paul's bigger epistles like Romans and 1 Corinthians, and then they work their way on down to the smaller ones.
Oh, okay.
But those letters were written during Paul's career, which ended in the year 67. And for each one of those, you could go to, for instance, ntcanon.org. That's one place to look for more data about that.
Okay.
And by the time we get to the book of Revelation, this is the last book that's written. Now, I don't want to skip the general epistles, but just to get to this point,
right.
By the time of the Emperor Domitian, the Romans had decided that Christianity is a new religion, and by new they meant illegal. The standard Roman policy was whenever the Romans would attack another country and overcome it, or when another country would say, "Hey, Rome, we want to be part of your empire or part of your republic," before the emperors, their own policy was, all right, you can have all the religions that you already have, but nothing new, because the thought was that if they had a new religion and it was a esoteric or secretive religion, that it could just as easily be a let's assassinate the Roman emperor club, or let's figure out how we can undermine the Romans. And so the Roman policy was, no new religion. Keep what you already have. That's fine,
Okay.
but no, don't make any new religion. And that was also policy when Israel became part of Rome around the year 63. In the days when just before Julius Caesar and all that,
Yeah.
Pompey the Great conquered the pirates, and he was also instrumental there with Israel becoming part of Rome. And he made the policy, okay, they don't worship our gods, that's okay, as long as they don't cause a lot of trouble, they can still be part of Rome. And so the Jews didn't have to worship the Olympic gods, the gods of Mount Olympus, like Zeus and Apollo and all the others.
Okay.
Well, most Romans in other places would, and they would sometimes call them different names, like Zeus might be go by a different name, but when they made the statues, it was still looked like Zeus and was worshipped like Zeus. Yeah. So,
Interesting.
but when during the time of Paul, one of the issues was, is Christianity something new? And Paul would argue, I believe, if you were to ask him that question, he would say Christianity is not something new. It's like the Old Testament was sitting on this egg, and in the New Testament, the egg has hatched. It's not a new egg out of nowhere. It has come intrinsically from the Old Testament, from what the prophets prophesied and foretold. You have
Okay.
the gospel of Christ.
That's why they put them together.
Yeah, part of the reason.
Okay.
But to the Romans, by the 90s, the Romans would look at Christianity and say, okay, um, Jews always circumcise. Christians say you can take it or leave it.
Mm-hmm.
Jews worship on the Sabbath day. The Christians say you can take it or leave it. The Jews have strict dietary laws. The Christians say you can take it or leave it. So the Romans conclude they're not the same thing. And because they're not the same thing, that means Judaism is still legal, Christianity is not. Now in the mid 60s, the Emperor Nero had persecuted some Christians, that's why Peter and Paul were killed, around the vicinity of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Domitian said, we're going to say Christianity is illegal as a matter of official Roman policy. And so during his term of office, or his reign, Christianity was persecuted simply for being Christianity. Christians were considered atheists because they didn't worship the pantheon of Roman and Greek gods.
Okay.
Now, of course, if you asked a Christian if he was an atheist or not, he'd say, "No, no, we worship the one true God. You guys are the ones that don't worship the one true God because you worship many gods." Time out for medicine.
Okay. That's pretty interesting stuff, actually. Because I never really have looked into how all this came about.
Okay. Well, by so when John is there in the late 90s,
Mm-hmm.
he gets brought to Rome, and the Emperor Domitian is somewhat impressed, but also sees Christianity as a threat because Emperor Domitian himself has a following that consider him a god. And of course, when John is saying there's only one God, that gets him condemned to the island of Cyprus. Now, Cyprus was not a place that would be conducive to survival.
So
So
they would consider people as gods
the
as well.
Romans had a custom of deifying their emperors. And it
Okay.
wasn't. It varied from emperor to emperor. Some emperors took it seriously, and some of the emperors kind of mocked the very idea that they were a god. But they appreciated the popularity that they could get by saying, "If you are loyal, then you'll give me your allegiance, and you'll express the allegiance by offering some incense to me, or by offering a grain offering to me." And
Mm-hmm.
that was done, and that was required of the Christians at certain times. Not all throughout the days of the Roman Empire, but when certain emperors came to power, like Domitian, or later on Decius, and later after him Diocletian, at those
Mm-hmm.
particular points, it was made incumbent upon the Christians to worship the emperor as a god. Now, of course, the Christians would refuse, and
Uh-huh.
that was and because of that, persecution would follow in those time periods.
Okay.
So,
Interesting.
at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, many of
325.
the Christians who were bishops by that point
Mm-hmm.
had gone through persecution. Now these weren't the brand new generation, but they were the immediately before this generation, all the way up to the year 313. There were Christians who had been killed. So lots of the people at the Council of Nicaea, and we have a record of this from Eusebius of Caesarea in what's called church history or ecclesiastical history, which you can still find. You can find the whole thing online. But in
Okay.
Eusebius's church history, he describes how when you went to the Council of Nicaea, it looked like you were going to the Veterans Convention for a war that had been very violent. There were people there who had had their tongues cut out. There
Oh
were people
wow.
there who had had their fingers cut off. There were
Oh.
people there that had gone through all sorts of terrible things.
Oh.
They had done this because they were faithful, because they refused to worship the emperor.
Oh wow. So that's when the persecution began.
Well,
Over
no, the
over.
persecution actually in the days of Constantine,
Okay.
persecution ceased. It had been a continuing thing up
Mhm.
until that time. Uh,
Okay.
Constantine Constantine had been a Roman and had worshipped the Roman gods and continued to mint coins with Roman gods on them, even after
Mm-hmm.
he said that he'd become a Christian.
Okay.
Constantine, though, had a rival, and this military rival, and at a particular battle called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, uh, his enemy's forces were on this side, and Constantine's forces were on this side, and he knew the collision was coming. And the story goes, now this is from Eusebius again, and the story goes, and of course there's no way to disprove the story because it involves what's recorded about a dream that Constantine had. And
Mm-hmm.
anybody could say, I have a dream. I saw a big turtle or something. There's no way really to disprove a dream. But Constantine said he had had a dream in which he heard a voice in the sky saying, "In this sign conquer." And the sign in the dream was, and there's some dispute about whether it was a cross or whether it was a chi rho symbol. A chi rho symbol means the letters chi and rho, which are the first two letters in the name of Christ. In many of
Okay.
the early manuscripts we have, the name of Jesus and the word Christ and the word God and the word Lord receive special treatment. They're 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 contracted. They're not written out usually. So when you see the word Christ, you won't see the whole word Christ. You'll just see the first letters and the last letters. But
Okay.
anyway, Constantine received this dream, or that's what he's reported to say, and said,
Mm-hmm.
"In this sign conquer." And so he told his soldiers, "Put this mark on your shields as you go into battle." And they did, either the cross or the Cairo. and his forces won the battle very decisively, and that's why Constantine proceeded to become the emperor of all of Rome. And with Constantine being a believer, he then said, "Okay, now we're going to legalize Christianity."
Okay.
So at that point, persecution stopped for a while at least, and Christianity was legal. And not only that, but Christianity was favored by Emperor Constantine because his mother, Helena, was very devout.
Right.
She had gone to Jerusalem and looked around at all the holy sites and tried to verify as much as could be verified.
Okay.
One of
What date, sorry, exactly did Christianity become legal?
we're looking at between the year 313 for its legalization, and 325 for its de facto adoption.
Okay.
325 is the year of the Council of Nicaea. Now, at the Council of Nicaea, they were not debating the books of the Bible.
Okay.
Everybody who was a Christian would recognize the authority of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There was a group in Egypt that was the Gnostics that we know from what was found at a place called Nag Hammadi.
That's the right. I've got it in front of me right now. I got a lot of questions.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
okay, so my understanding of these is that not until was it 1940 when we discovered these scriptures that nobody really knew what the Gnostics believed. It was only was there a book called something someone wrote called the Heresies, and it had like a few quotes in that, but nobody really knew what it
Well,
was.
that's partly right, but
Mhm.
Irenaeus was a bishop in what is now France, in the city of Lyon, which used to be, back in Roman times, it would be Lugdunum.
Okay.
Irenaeus, in a 5-part work, some of which is preserved in Greek and some of which is preserved in Latin, but it's a very, very formal Latin.
Mhm.
And in Irenaeus' book, he goes into some detail about what false teachers believed.
Mhm.
And one of the groups that he covers, well, more than one, is the Gnostics, who we know as what we know as the Gnostics.
Uh-huh.
To those of you who
Also,
are lost in the chat, like just an idea of what this guy's all about, he basically just gave you like the entire first 400-year history of the Roman Empire out of his head. So if you haven't been following along from the beginning, you're probably not going to get it. But I'm sure Chelsea is not lost. She's very intelligent and inquisitive. I think Chelsea's actually listening to him, unlike the chat. So yeah.
I mean, I guess it's people that's just joined, so. Oh,
He
but
just
it's better if you all just watch it back.
Mhm.
I'm gonna have to watch this back. Like you said, it's a lot of information. I'm trying to note it all down as I'm like going along.
It's crazy how much he knows. It's crazy how much you know about this stuff, James. Like
Yes,
seriously,
well,
you
all
like
out of your head, man.
Google.
Yeah, you're the Google of manuscript history and biblical history. Yeah.
well, one of the things that the Gnostics did, and then they were the only ones who do this. Even some of the good guys in the 2nd century and 3rd century did this sort of thing. Was how do you, if they would sit and say, how do I write a book that is authoritative when nobody cares who I am? Nobody cares what is the gospel of this guy who's living in the middle of the 100s or a little bit later. So what they would do was to make the work sound appear to be more authoritative. They would borrow the name of somebody who was considered close to the action.
Yeah.
Somebody like Philip or Thomas, somebody who is right there on the scene. And so they wouldn't write books in their own name. But they would write the book that said, because nobody's going to listen to, this is the gospel of Sam, the guy that lives in the Nile down there. They would say, this is the gospel of Philip, and present it as if it's the gospel of Philip.
Okay.
So that's where a lot of these Gnostic Gospels come from.
Mm.
Irenaeus
Yeah.
covered them to some extent. Also, there was another writer about 200 years. Well, let's just say he was about the year 375 is when he did, between 375 and the year 400. He did
Uh-huh.
most of his work. And he wasn't in Egypt, but he was aware of Egypt. So at that time, a guy named Epiphanius. And Epiphanius really went into detail using his earlier sources, not only Irenaeus, but he would also use Eusebius and other sources to put together this picture of these false teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at Irenaeus' writings and we look at Epiphanius' writings, we can get some idea of what the false teachers who were their contemporaries believed. So it's not just one source, but it's several sources. Irenaeus and Epiphanius, though, are two important ones.
Yeah, I've heard of them. They're the ones that I heard someone else talking about. So what happens? Is my question is why did all these particularly the Nag Hammadi ones, why did they just disappear? And then we found them again in a cave.
Well, it's difficult to know how much they were circulated to begin with. Uh,
Okay.
in some of the early Christian works, we have reports of a text existing, but
Mm-hmm.
Irenaeus never says how much how far it went. This was an area that was a specialty to him. He wasn't
Okay.
from France. He was from Asia Minor, which is much closer to Egypt than France is. So, but there were even Gnostics in Rome at one point,
Okay.
and but it's difficult to discern exactly how far Gnosticism would spread. Uh, in Egypt, you have Lower Egypt, and then you have other areas of Egypt,
Yeah.
and where Christianity was dominating and being persecuted, it was in a minority position. It couldn't really stop the spread of anything, but they could win arguments pretty well. Justin Martyr, when he was brought to trial for being a Christian, he wasn't quiet about it. He presented what's called an apology, and by apology, I don't mean I'm sorry. Justin wasn't sorry for being a Christian at all. By apology, we mean uh, giving a defense. So Justin was giving an ordered defense of his position as a Christian and
Mm-hmm.
explaining that Christians, rather than
Is
be bad
isn't it
citizens,
crazy that that's the guy that like the whole martyrdom word came from, right? Justin Martyr. Like
well,
to
no, martyr simply is based on the Greek word martyr, which just means to witness. But the act of martyrdom is a witness in and of itself.
yeah, like where you die for a cause or whatever.
Yeah. So he's
Yeah,
known as Justin Martyr because he was
yeah.
martyred.
Oh, okay,
His,
okay.
the account of his martyrdom is very famous, and it was recorded by an eyewitness, somebody who was there on the scene very close after it happened. So Justin's martyrdom is very well known. In fact, you can go online and just Google it, and I'm sure after a few hits it'll turn up. But that was around the year 160.
Okay.
But
So
can you? I think I lost track of what your question was. Can you remind me?
um so basically was like what happened to them. I think you basically covered all that. So then they found these scriptures in this cave. How did they date them, and how did they know when the originals were written? Is my next question.
The Nag Hammadi text you're talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it was a cave. Basically, somebody went digging to find a certain kind of soil which would be good for using like as fertilizer, and
Okay.
came across a pot.
Mm-hmm.
Was wondering, I don't know if I should break open this pot or not, but eventually they did. And so that's where a lot of them came from. But the place that Nag Hammadi wasn't too far from the same place where we found some Christian papyri. So there was probably some interaction between the two groups.
Okay.
That's an extrapolation. We don't have videotape.
Yeah, good point. So what did they use to date these back? So they found them. I think it was like a family, a couple of brothers or something, and then they passed it over to a priest, and they were like, wow.
Yeah, it eventually got to people that knew what to do with it, and
Mhm.
it was if you water it down a little bit and you yeast it a little bit, add a little bit of yeast so the story grows a little bit. Then they get to saying, well, you get claims like you saw in the Da Vinci Code where people say, oh, there were 80 Gospels. Well, the Gospels they're talking about there, if you read the fine print, are Gospels like the Gospel of Philip, where this is.
And by the way, Chelsea, if you were a book, you'd definitely be the fine print.
But this is cases like the Gospel of Philip. It's not the Gospel of Philip, like the Philip that we know from the Gospels of Jesus.
Yeah, they just called it that.
Somebody else saying,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, the Gospel of Philip. He wrote this book, and we just now found it. Let's listen to what Philip has to say." Well, really, in real life, it's not has any connection directly to Philip. But one text that is mentioned by Irenaeus, as I recall, feel free to double check me on that. But one text that is of special importance is called the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
Judging from internal characteristics, like for instance, when a later writer is trying to look like earlier, but he accidentally mentions a later event that the real person couldn't recall because it hadn't happened yet in his lifetime. A lot of these Gnostic Gospels are manifestly later, either internally or by other means.
Do you know? Do you know what the event was specifically?
The event being.
You said the reason that we know that when they were written, because it is mentioned, there's a certain event within here that's mentioned that couldn't possibly have been around that time.
Oh, yeah.
That's the thing. So what event is that specifically?
It would vary from composition to composition, but most of the Gospels would have, and again, you'd have to bring up one and we have to analyze it. But for instance, in the great Sapphire Gospel, one of them that Irenaeus mentions, there are characteristics in it where it's not so much intrinsically obvious at first, but smaller points are like if there's a, how would I put it? If there's something like it's a quotation from the Sibylline Oracles, well, that quotation based on the Sibylline Oracles has to be at least as late as the Sibylline Oracles. So little details like that.
Okay, I see.
But one that's thought to be earliest is the Gospel of Thomas. And that's thought to be one of the earliest. And there's some question about exactly how Gnostic is it, because another person kind of came onto the scene around the year 140, and that was Martian, who's known to us also from Irenaeus. Martian was from a place called Pontus, which was like northern Turkey.
Okay. What date? What's the date? They give the Gospel of Thomas.
It varies from scholar to scholar, but I would say generally between about 130 or 140.
130, 140.
And
okay.
But by that time, there are Christians who are also writing what's called pseudepigrapha. And pseudepigrapha doesn't have anything to do with pigs. It has to do with pseudo, false, and then graphe, which is writing, put them together, and you get falsely named writings.
Okay.
And pseudepigrapha, right in the 200s, there was a lot of it, because the idea of saying, "Oh, this is what this person said," but he sealed his book, and just now we've opened it up, and let me tell you what it says. That was the way a lot of folks were doing it, whether their agenda was good or whether their agenda was not so good. And so you have things like the Life of St. Thomas, or the Tales of St. Peter, or the Mission of this saint or that one, or St. Sebastian would be a later saint who will be in the picture. So you have very many works in what was called the Lucian Acts, or the Lucian Acts. It's spelled Leucian. And that's where you get some interesting accounts. Many of them are mixed with legitimate traditions, but as far as the didactic portion, they're all over the map. Some are not so bad, and some are pretty wild. But the Gospel of Thomas is unusual because its sayings of Jesus are never too far out there. About the farthest out it gets, at one point, Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, and I remember we're talking, this is not really the Gospel of Thomas, the historical man named Thomas. This is somebody saying what they wish Jesus would say, but they're clearly using some sources that have some connection.
Yeah, there's a little. It seems to I read through this. I study a lot of different faiths and religions, and it seems like they've taken a little bit of Buddhism, a little bit of Hinduism, and put it into this.
Well, I wouldn't say there's any Hinduism or Buddhism in the Gospel of Thomas.
Just the kind of vibe it gives off. God is one. You have to make everything into one. The two into one. The upper the lower kind of.
Well, what Martian and lots of Martians' ideas were adopted into Gnosticism. Martian's idea wasn't that God is one. His big idea, and this is why he wasn't kept around as a Christian, but his idea was God is two. That
two?
Yeah.
What was that again? Martian.
Marcion.
Cion.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
His idea was that the Old Testament God, the God of Moses, the God who gave the commandments and the whole Old Testament law and everything, that God wasn't the real God. It was a God who thought he was the real God, but he was deluded. He was called the Demiurge.
James, we're gonna have to do a whole new show on this, bro, because I got to admit, lately I've been thinking the God of the Old Testament is a different God than Jesus.
Yeah, we can get into that a little bit now. The Demiurge is basically
because there's so many atrocities in the Old Testament that I just can't wrap my brain around, like raping women, bashing babies against rocks, jealous God, jealous this, and then Jesus comes and he's like a bipolar, completely opposite, loving God, loving, healing, sick. I just can't wrap my head around it, bro.
Yeah, we should set up another stream about the contents of these Gospels. But this can just be the dates, where they came from and stuff. And then we should do another one, analyzing.
If you're feeling up to it, anyway.
If you don't mind.
Okay, but I don't want to let go of this thread about what Martian thought. Okay. His idea was that the Old Testament God thought he was God, but he was not really the God. But he gave all these commands as if he was. And then when Jesus comes along, he's sent from the real God.
Yeah.
And so he is considered by Martian to have this real gospel, as opposed to the old Judaic gospel. And that's why when Martian considers the four gospels, he doesn't like them, because Jesus' affiliation with the God of the Old Testament and Jesus' use of the Old Testament and his affirmation of the Old Testament, and pointing to all these prophecies about himself in the law. Well, there's Moses, and in the Psalms, and in the prophets, and that's the Old Testament. Marcion didn't like to see that, and so while the Christians have the Gospel of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, Marcion just started with Luke and said, "This is the real gospel. It's just Luke, but only the parts that don't involve the Old Testament." And so, as Tertullian, a Christian in the late 100s, very early 200s, would say, Tertullian would say that Marcion edited the Old Testament, or edited rather the New Testament, with a knife instead of a pen. He would just cut out the parts he didn't like.
Oh, okay.
And so Marcion, in the early 100s or the mid 100s, had a copy of Luke that he himself had edited and revised. And he also took about 10 of Paul's letters, not the whole corpus or the whole body of Paul's writings, but took some of Paul's letters and said, no, these are the real letters of Paul. So he would kind of pick and choose what was real and authentic.
Yeah, because you got to remember, all this gospel stuff came out like hundreds of years after all the original scriptures, right? So you always have to keep that in mind. Like,
that's where I have a little bit of a difference in thinking. How did they date these? And how do they know that the ones they found were the originals? If they're dating these...
So what are you saying? How do you know that the Mark, Matthew, the chronological Gospels are older than the Gnostic Gospels?
Well,
is that basically what you're asking?
No, I'm asking how they dated it. I mean, with Thomas, there's no mention of any events, like you say. It's just sayings.
I think it's because of the wordings and the stuff that they're saying, and the way they're speaking at that history and time places it at that. I don't know. Maybe James could take the question better than I could.
Yeah.
Well, for the canonical Gospels, for instance, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay.
When Justin is writing, but by the time Justin writes, and he's writing, well, one of his compositions is called Dialogue with Trypho, and that's online. Feel free to look it up. But by the time he's writing Dialogue with Trypho,
hear Chelsea writing all this stuff down. You hear her writing all this. You hear her writing all this stuff down. That's how inquisitive she is, bro. She's listening to everything you're saying. She's going to be studying
to that part of the book.
Okay. Well, just as he's writing, the second Jewish revolt with Bar Kokhba has just happened around the year 132. And so as he's writing this, he's already using a combination of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's already combined their writings into one continuous account. And so obviously Matthew, Mark, and Luke can't be any earlier than the combination of them that Justin is using. And you also have writers like Polycarp. He doesn't quote them a whole lot, but he does use them repeatedly. And so that's one reason why we know that, well, they can't be any later than Polycarp, because obviously Polycarp is there using them. Polycarp is Polcarp, and his writings too are online. Now, just as people in the second century were making pseudepigrapha about the apostles, they also made some pseudepigrapha about Polycarp, and so there's two different collections of works that are attributed to Polycarp. So I would go with the shorter collection as being genuine, and the later one as being pseudepigraphical.
Okay. So, do you know anything about the secret book of John? Can you tell me a little bit about that one?
There are one of two books at least that go by that title.
Is it the Apocrypha? Something of John. Hang on, this is jumping up on my computer.
Well, they're the apocryphal Acts of John, and that's
Not the axe. It would be the other one then that I'm referring to. But yeah, tell us about these 2 books.
It might be best if you would act like I've forgotten.
So there's the Secret Book of John. I don't know if you've ever read any of this, but it's the one that is describing what God is. And it goes, can we pull it up?
Mm-hmm.
I know now it's getting really deep. Let me find this.
Just pull it up and share your screen.
Are you
I don't
talking
know.
about the Apocryphon of John?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking at it on Wikipedia. I don't have it handy because some of my books are over at the church right now. I'm at the parsonage. So I'm going to have to go on memory here.
I linked it in the private chat. I don't know, Nick, if you want to share screen.
Yeah, sure.
And
yeah, what did you say, James? You have to go soon?
No, I said my copies of the law.
I heard that. I heard that part.
Are over at the church, while I myself am at the parsonage. Right.
Oh, okay. Got you.
So I don't have direct access.
Okay. Okay, where would you like me to go to, Chelsea?
The one. Just scroll down until. Hang on. Can we get a translation down? See, so they, in my interpretation, they don't believe there are 2 gods. They believe they're like lower entities, and they believe that God is actually everything and all things. Kind of stuff. This is where you know the Hinduism comes into it, the Buddhism, because they have this similar belief.
I think it might look like Hinduism, but there's really other factors that are in the background.
Right.
Like if you read this one passage, or like what is the context of this chapter?
Well, I would ask, show me the most Hindu part of this.
Okay. So do you want me to read this?
I mean, it's just the fact. See, I have this interpretation that most Christians believe God is some kind of entity that exists within something and is creating something. Whereas the Hindus think the overall God, the Om, is just the whole of existence itself. Same with the Buddhists. They believe that God, like they don't believe Buddha was a god, but the sayings of Buddha speak about God being just everything that exists is God, and we are within him. God cannot exist within anything as its full form. It's the fullness of everything itself that exists is God. Is basically what this is saying. I mean, we can read through.
Well, I think what you're mistaking as Hinduism is really Platonism.
Mm-hmm. I've never heard of that. What is that?
Well, Platonism or Platonic thought, that would be best expressed in the writings of a writer who came along a little bit later, named Plotinus. Plotinus, Plotinus.
Is that the? I think you just mentioned that dude, right?
Plotinus. No, this was a different guy he's talking about. How do you say that again, James?
Oh, yeah, let me write this down, please.
Plotinus.
Okay.
He kind of encapsulates various elements of.
How did you spell that again for her? Plotinus.
Plotinus.
AUS.
No, US.
US, yeah, US.
Plotinus.
NUS. Okay.
Oh, PLOT. Okay. Plotinus. All right.
Okay, you can continue.
Do you want us to read what I brought up on screen or no?
I mean, it kind of gets the basic concept, right? You kind of understand what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah, I know the things that you talking about that look like the Hinduism, but it's not really Hinduism, it's Platonism.
Okay.
And there was this duality in which ideals were theorized, and this had to do with philosophy of basically when you have pagans who are just guessing, and it collides with things that appear to that are presented as if they're more than just guessing, and they gradually resolved into a system of what Irenaeus describes as realms or the demiurge, and the
Uh-huh.
demiurge then gives birth to these other aeons,
Yeah.
and Plotinus gets into the aeons.
Okay.
In other words, realms of influence in the spiritual realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right on. You're right on.
Well, you guys,
How
it's
do you-
been like an hour here. I think maybe we should take some questions from the audience if there is any, and think about
Yeah.
wrapping it up.
Yeah, I'm gonna look all this stuff up.
I would like
Can
to see
we?
the masturbation one in the chat. Masturbation, I probably sound more tired than I really am, so don't worry. I don't need rest. I'm fine.
Mm-hmm. We got another stream in an hour, but I would really, really, really love to get you back on. It's because I don't know.
A couple people
you
get
just
it,
know
man.
you know everything, and
Like this guy, he's like, yeah, he's talking about Macaronian of Sinope in Rome, and like, there's a couple people that are like, this guy knows what he's talking about. It's like he's hard to understand because of his stroke. Like I'm saying, you listen to what James is saying, it will blow your mind, dude. The guy's intelligent.
yeah, I would love to do like more into this what they believed. You're talking about the demiurge, the eons, the realms within realms, and all this stuff. Like this stuff, like really interests me, and where it comes from. Where does this idea come from?
Yeah.
Originate?
I think there was a question. It was James. I don't know. It's obviously like a hard question to answer, but you might have your input on it. How come there is no record of Jesus from the time he's like 12 to 30?
Oh yeah, that's that. I wondered. I
always just kind of thought because it didn't really matter, like it wasn't important. But I don't know. What do you think?
There are records, but are they
Well,
legit?
there are records, but the records are pseudepigrapha too. It's basically somebody saying, I wonder what happened to Jesus after he turned 12, and then next time we see him, he's 30.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, how can you trust them?
And so somebody made up a story to answer the question.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in the course of that, they made up stories, and some of those stories even made it into the Quran, and that reflects on how trustworthy.
Yeah, I was telling Chelsea about that. The infancy gospel of Thomas is in the Quran, where he's like speaking from his crib and like making clay birds fly, and like yeah, for sure, for sure.
So people later on made up stories to answer the question, but in real life, the gospel writers didn't just make things up. They had to depend on the sources. Luke says, I went and talked with some of those who were there on the scene so that his reader, Theophilus, would have an exact knowledge about what happened regarding Jesus. And so when Luke didn't have a source, or when Luke had a period of Jesus' life that he didn't have information about from somebody else, rather than just make something up, he would simply bypass it, and that's why we don't have information from that period. He says he grew up, and of course recognize too, their part of their reason for writing is to show why Jesus is important, and most of that happened when you had Peter and Matthew on the scene with what Jesus was doing. When they went there to report, there's no reporting factor. So his career, his ministry, that's what they're concerned about. That's where the act of redemption is underway. So it's after John the Baptist is on the scene and declaring to people, hey, the one who's going to come after me, he's the one. So it's only after John the Baptist that the story of the Gospels really begins. we do have the story of his birth in Matthew and Luke, because that question was already being raised.
Mm-hmm.
But aside from that, we see the focus on his ministry, because that's when we see him active as the Messiah, doing messianic things and fulfilling messianic prophecies from Isaiah and other prophets.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask
Okay.
you just another quick question?
Sure.
So there's is it the Sutra P dot? I don't know if you know. This is is that how you say it? Okay.
Yeah.
So
He knows like
do you
everything.
know do you know the date that is written?
The pseudepigrapha ranges widely. There was some pseudepigrapha that was written in the very early 100s, things like the Apocalypse of Peter.
Okay.
That was a fairly orthodox work. It was quoted by some of the early church writers.
Okay.
On the other hand, you also have later things like things that talk about the apostles going and conquering cities, having populations convert in one day. Some of those things are rather late and
Yeah,
rather tied
I
to.
would bet.
Do you
So where
remember the
does
story of Androcles and Androcles with the lion,
mm-hmm.
and
I don't
the
think.
lion that becomes tame because he has a thorn
Oh,
is in the
thorn.
lion.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. I remember that
thorn is
story. He
in the
pulls
lion's
out.
claw. Yeah, and so Androcles pulls out the thorn, and then later on, Androcles is arrested by the Romans and sentenced to die in the arena. And lo and behold, the very lion that is sent to eat Androcles is this very lion. And it comes up to him, and all the Romans will scream and kill him. But but the lion recognizes who Androcles is. Well, that
Okay.
story is not unique to the martyrs. It goes back before then. But
Okay.
but that story was recast, and to the point where it's really about Androcles, a Christian, being thrown to the lions and so forth. And so
Okay.
some of the old stories, probably one of the best known is the story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, which made it into the Quran. And the story goes that there were these Christians being persecuted, and the Romans were hot on the trail, and they were running for their life, and they went into a cave. And for one reason or another, the Romans couldn't quite figure out why they went, and they were afraid to go back out because the Romans would still look for them. And so they stayed there for a while, and they all fell asleep. When they woke up, they said, "Well, we can't stay here in the cave. We just better go surrender, and we'll die. At least we'll die faithfully for Christ." But when they went up to town, the Roman soldiers were like, "We don't persecute you." And when they went to buy something, because had all been asleep for a while, they went to buy, but the money, the Christians, the people in the marketplace said, "What are you doing with such old money?" And they said, "Well, it's not old. We just got this money." And said, "Oh yes, this money is very old." And gradually, it dawned on them that they had been sleeping for a very long time, and
Mm-hmm.
so when they wake up, they come into they go to sleep in a world where Christianity is persecuted. They wake up in a world where Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire. And the story uh, can't be any earlier than the 300s. So the pseudepigrapha and the legends vary quite a bit from the early 100s on into the 300s.
Okay. The
There,
thing that
there was
was weird is that within that it mentions that Buddha prophesizes the coming of Jesus Christ. But then if this was written after, they could have just thrown that in there.
Yeah, I would look askance at anybody that wants to seriously suggest that in the writings of Buddha we have a prophecy foretelling about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But again, even in a case like that, just as there are cases of pseudepigrapha writers saying, "Oh yeah, we found this book by Philip," and they present it that way, but it's not really by Philip; it's by a guy in Egypt who had never met Philip. The same sort of thing could happen in other traditions. It's not a unique phenomenon.
Okay.
James, you're amazing, brother, but we really got to go. But before you
Yeah,
go,
thank
I
you.
seen you on your Facebook in your Trump hat, which I love because I love Trump. Hence my name, Nicholas Trump. So I want to show you something that you'd look really good in, bro. This is a mask that Chelsea designed. Trump 2024. I'll be back. Yeah.
I doubt if Donald Trump himself runs again, but if he put his weight behind the campaign of Mr. DeSantis from Florida, it'd be interesting to see how
Uh-huh.
fast the Republicans can retake the House and the Senate and the presidency.
What do you think about the whole election? Do you think there's something a little suspicious went on there?
I think it was a very, very close election, but that's really not what I came to discuss.
Yeah, we can't go in. It'll just be going off for like till our next show, and we'll be doing a double header, and I'll be like so tired. So you're the man, James Snapp.
Thank you so much for coming on.
You're a pastor, so if you'd like to close in prayer, that'd be cool.
Okay, I hope this was helpful. Like I said, at ntcanon.org,
Okay.
Glenn Davis has put some stuff together that should be very helpful.
Well, if you would like in the future, like Chelsea said, we can set up some further shows about this if you're into that.
Okay, I look
Okay,
forward to
cool.
it. But for the time being, let's close in prayer.
Thank
Okay.
Dear
you.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for giving us your word. And Father, we thank you for the tradition of early Christianity, people who, instead of offering a little handful of grain or incense, they would rather die than be unfaithful to you. Lord, please help us to have that same kind of faith and the same confidence that you'll be our Lord in eternity. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, brother. I love you, and you're getting better, and that's awesome. So just let me know, and we'll set a show up for sometime whenever you're feeling up to it. Okay, man.
All right.
God bless
Thank
you.
you. It was nice to meet you. Hope to speak to you again.
You definitely will, and thank you everybody for watching. Even Master Bates. You guys have a good night. Bye, guys. See you in an hour. Come to our next show. We have another stream in like less than an hour.